So, good evening, everyone. I am Constance Moreto, Associate Academic Program Officer at the Terra Foundation for American Art. I wanted to start by warmly thanking our two speakers, Jo Aplin and Miguel de Baca, who are coming from London and Oxford, especially for this occasion. I also want to thank all of you for coming this evening. Please do not hesitate to ask questions and make comments at the end of their presentations. Works authored by both of the speakers greatly inspired the shaping of the dialogue's topic. I will come back to this later. So, Jo Aplin joined the Courtauld Institute of Art in 2016 after 11 years teaching at the University of York. She has been the recipient of numerous fellowships and prizes, including fellowships at the Canadian Centre for Architecture, at the University of Cambridge Centre for Gender Studies, at the Corpus Christi College, at the Terra Foundation, and we were very lucky to have her as senior scholar at the Terra Summer Residency in 2016. Her first book, based on her PhD project, Eccentric Objects, Rethinking Sculpture in 1960s America, published by Yale University Press, examines, among several case studies, works by Lee Bontecou, whose works constitute an important reference for this dialogue. More generally, this book paves the way for a more inclusive and pluralistic approach to American sculpture in the 1960s. Still, in 2012, another of her books came out entitled Yayoi Kusama, Infinity Mirror Room, Follies Field, and testifies to her continued interest in the works that didn't fit easily into narratives of the 1960s American art. In addition, Jo has just completed her book, Not Walking, Lee Lozano versus the Art World, 1969-1971, which was awarded in 2015 the Susan and James Miller Books Prize from the National Museum of Women in the Arts, Washington, D.C. She is also currently completing London Art Worlds, Mobile, Contingent and Ephemeral Networks, 1960-1980, published by Penn State University Press, which she is co-editing with Catherine Spencer and Amy Tobin. She has also started working on a new book project exploring aging and abstraction in American art since 1940. On these subjects, Jo curated an exhibition at the end of 2016 at the York Art Gallery. Entitled Flesh, it examined relation between the body and aging, race and gender, touch and texture, and surface and skin. I am also delighted to have Miguel de Baca participate in this dialogue. Associate Professor of Art History at Lake College, Forest College, Miguel is the chair of American Studies program. Focusing on American studies and cultural histories, his works deal with a large number of subjects, ranging from memory making, relations between the representation of history and abstraction, video and digital art, culture jamming, protests, artistic collaborations, and critical studies of race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality. This year is Terra Foundation Visiting Professor of American Art at the Art and Art History Department of the University of Oxford. His seminar in Oxford intersects transnationalism in American art history with memory studies. Miguel's monograph, Memory Walk, and Truitt and Sculpture, published in 2015 by University of California Press, introduced the topic of memory in the understanding of minimalist art, a very original approach that was nearly absent before in the narrative of this movement. It is fascinating to understand how Truitt's resistance to established male authority prevailing in high-modernism art was anchored in the making of memory. For this book, Miguel received a Wyeth Foundation for American Art publication grant. He also co-edited with Makeda Best Conflict, Identity and Protest in American Art, published in 2016 by Cambridge Scholars Publishing. He is currently working on a book project entitled Video Art and Public Culture, examining activist use of video and digital art from the 1960s forward. He has been fellow at Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation, at Georgia O'Keeffe Museum Research Center, at Dumbarton Oaks, and at the SAM. He was a recipient of an Andrew Mellon Foundation grant for his contribution to Digital Chicago, a multimedia online platform investigating Chicago's cultural histories from 1892 to 1933. So as shown by the title of this dialogue, Women Inside and Outside the Grid, New Approaches to Modernist Culture, there is no emphasis on feminist engagement, even though I'm quite sure it will be addressed tonight. The definition of the subject of this dialogue was based first on works by the artists Anne Truitt and Lee Bontecou, after reading the thought-provoking works accomplished by our two speakers. None of them claimed to produce works that could be defined as feminine or feminist. However, it should be noted that their works were among the only ones to be presented alongside minimalist artworks by male artists. One of the things that appeared to be interesting to us was how these artists unsettled the understanding of gender. It happened through forms of abstraction, while in some cases it took on almost figurative or functional, or it accommodated with a persistence of narrative expression. It is all the more striking that female artists' relation to minimalists and abstract forms have not been a key concern for a long time. In her introduction to the catalogue of the exhibition More Than Minimal, Abstraction in the 70s, in 1996, the American curator Susan Stoops suggested that the dominant modern abstract aesthetics and feminism were, I quote, two apparently disparate forces, end of quote. She was here concentrating on the art of the 1970s, but I believe it was already the case for art of the 60s. Abstraction has different meanings here, including reflection on its limits, which are worth questioning. Other examples will be shown besides Bontecou and Truitt, sometimes works that are more openly feminist. I won't elaborate more on this. I would rather let Joe and Miguel discuss on how the body of artists could be much further extended in academic and curatorial researches. Finally, I will quote the very long-term project and online resources carried out by AWARE, led by the art historian Camille Moreno, restoring the presence of 20th century women artists in the history of art. I shall now hand to give the floor to our two guest speakers.
Good evening. So I've titled my talk "All Freedom in Every Sense," which is a line that Lee Bontecou used to describe what it was that she hoped her work would achieve when pressed to give a more definitive explanation of its meaning by critics. And it's in relation to her work that I'm going to organise my thoughts this evening. So she's an American sculptor, Lee Bontecou. Here she is. She is an artist whose work I first became interested in as part of a larger project which focused on the changing status of sculpture in the United States during the mid-60s. And now, as then, I'm interested in the eccentric, the erotic, even psychotic, as one critic described Yayoi Kusama's sculpture in 1964. That is, sculpture that exceeded the critical vocabularies available at the time and that demanded instead we attend to them in ways as yet uncharted, or which operate according to an alternative logic of viewing and encountering the work of art. I'm showing you here, of course, Louise Bourgeois posing with her 1968 latex and later bronze abstract erotic sculpture Fillette. She performs for the camera of Robert Mapplethorpe precisely the kind of alternative, perverse logic of viewing and imagining the work I want to think about here. Fillette is a work that is so clearly of the body, yet which of course insistently exceeds it. It's also very interesting, I think, in relation to the idea of aging and the erotic, which she is also playing with here. So in that earlier project, I wanted to think about how abstraction was marshalled in ways that signified beyond the pictorial frame, to draw in but also expand out into the world beyond. When the critic and minimalist artist Donald Judd published his important overview of the sculptural scene in his 1965 essay Specific Objects, he identified Bontecou as one of those artists then working as the as yet unnamed space between painting and sculpture. Judd meant to invoke a space that was conceptually uncertain, but what fascinates me about Bontecou is how her work, giant, heavy relief sculptures, literally articulate that space between painting and sculpture in a formal and material as much as an intellectual manner. So I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to return to thinking about Bontecou, and I would like to thank the Terra for kindly inviting me today, to Constance for her lovely introduction, and as well to Miguel, who we've enjoyed talking about this topic over the weeks, and of course to you for being here. Okay. In the mid-1960s, Lee Bontecou was the only woman artist represented by Leo Castelli's gallery, where she showed alongside Robert Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, Frank Stella and others. And I'm showing you a photo here of Castelli from 1960. The work by Bontecou is on the wall behind him next to Rauschenberg's bed. Bontecou's relationship to modernism and also feminism is complicated. Abstraction, geometry and an insistence on close attendance to the pictorial plane, albeit one that projects into space from the wall, were key to her work. She was adamant that her work was far more closely connected to abstract expressionism than to the large three-dimensional assemblage objects by her contemporary peers, such as John Chamberlain and Rauschenberg, although we know she was an admirer of one contemporary, the sculptor Eva Hesse, whose work I'm going to draw into our conversation too. Along with Hesse, Bontecou refused the label feminism as it began to gain currency in the later years of the decade, as too limiting, too dangerous for the ways in which it threatened to close down the work's possibilities, particularly when that work was abstract. All freedom in every sense was Bontecou's description of how she imagined her work functioning in the world. It was between 1959 and 67 that she made a large number of wall-mounted metal and fabric abstract reliefs. These varied in size from a few inches square to several meters in length and height. Bontecou incorporated cavities into her reliefs, large holes or craters that puncture the surface. To make them, she welded complex skeletal structures from a series of flat steel rods to form the large, bulbous, arcing forms that were then fixed to the metal frame. A series of striking photographs taken of Bontecou at work in the early 60s by Hans Namuth show how she went about making the work. Of course, interestingly, we tend to think of him very much as the photographer of Jackson Pollock of abstract expressionism. So covering that welded metal framework with a semi-geometric patchwork skin of fabric and other materials, which included welded strips of metal and epoxy, Bontecou would stitch the fabric swatches to the fused steel rods, not with delicate stitches of cotton thread, but with short, sharp sections of wire, twisting the ends together to join the fabric covering to the metal armature. I hope that's kind of clear from these photographs. It's quite complicated to imagine her working process. In several of the earliest works, such as this one from 1959, the cavity is so big it almost fills the entire frame, and the void is almost as deep as it is wide. The appearance of that ink-black interior space was generated by thick sheets of black fabric that Bontecou attached to the back of the frame to give the impression that the void goes on into infinity, as though it's a boundless black hole. What I like about this photograph is, in fact, you can see the inside. It's been lit in a rather inelegant way, and we see exactly how she made it. But in others, and often when you see them, you really are just staring into a void. such as this one here. So this is Untitled. It's actually from 1961, apologies. This is in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It looks better seen askance, flat on, it doesn't always register. So this is another complex structure. It measures almost 2 meters square, and the void is one of her most cavernous. It's almost 1 meter deep. A series of curved sections of taut canvas telescope out from the frame, recalling earlier 20th century forms of biomorphic abstraction as they jut, curve, arc, and angle away from the surface ridges. Although from a distance, Bontecou's relief works can often seem two-dimensional, with the sections of tawny burlap, leather and thick canvas registering at first like the polychrome painterly surfaces of analytic cubism, or perhaps a more lyrical expressionist explosion of colour and form, Untitled, I think, stops such a reading dead in its tracks. Encountering this work firsthand, the viewer is confronted by the sheer materiality of its matte, dirty surface. The stubby twists of wire and horizontal slices of incorporated metal saw teeth are clearly real and potentially harmful to touch. They strain at the limits of both representation, for the urge to read the whole as a mouth or an eye is almost irresistible, and its status as relief sculpture, for its heavy metal frame threatens to break loose from the wall. You see how she's incorporated those band saw teeth here into the hole. So this is a work that seems on the face of it open to such figurative terms of description, incorporating rope alongside the more familiar materials of burlap, its welded steel armature and metal casing, its large void barred by a double row of sharp saw teeth blades. Standing alone in close proximity to this imposing 6-foot-high work is unnerving, and the urge to read the crater as bodily, as evoking biting, chomping jaws, a blind staring eye, or a sexual orifice is almost irresistible. That rope hanging from the relief is an odd, extraneous element. It issues a tacit invitation to pull it, as one would a bell, a thought that sets off a train of almost comically grotesque possibilities that the relief might suddenly crank into action and become animate and functional. The dangling length of rope triggers a response in which pulling this handle feels less a theoretical possibility than the intended outcome of this particular viewing encounter, in which both subject, the viewer, and object, the relief, stand on the cusp of participation, instigating a series of potentially dire consequences of incorporation, decapitation, or maybe even seduction. These abstract bodily correlates of Bontecou's carry a palpably libidinal charge. They hang at head height to meet, greet, or possibly eat us. And Bontecou, in a very rare description of her work, said that the object registers here like war equipment with teeth. In the early to mid-60s, the slightly off-key and eccentric aspect of relief sculpture, precisely its in-between status, appealed to artists formulating alternative ways of working with 3 dimensions that retained an affiliation to painting and drawing, even as it expanded beyond the parameters and boundaries of the wall and frame. Certainly for Eva Hesse, the relief format provided an innovative means through which to work out her relationship to 3 dimensions, particularly in the series of large, brightly coloured pop-like wall reliefs that she made in 1965. These early works, the titles of which are playfully nonsensical, for example, Umama Bumba, Eta from Decatur, and Ring Around a Rosie, which as you see on the right. These works declare an allegiance to painting and the drawn line, even as they expand its possibilities, incorporating coils of string, wooden cog and peg formations, and cut-out biomorphic forms that appear as though fragmentary abstract shapes, pushed to the edges of the rectangles of masonite to which they're bolted and glued, as though in danger of slipping clear of the frame. By 1966, a more minimalist inflection began to seep into Hesse's work. Although the erotic, bodily and playful aspect of her earlier drawings and colourful relief works persisted, her work, like Bontecou's, was resolutely abstract, yet she allowed the associations with the bodily and erotic to ripple throughout her objects, to offer an undercurrent of perversity that undermines the austerity of her monochrome palette. By mid-decade, this is around 67, Hesse's sculptural work began to incorporate materials that ranged from papier-mâché to string, latex, rope, balloon moulds and foam, and they were variously presented as a series of absurdly inflated, elongated, bandaged and multiplied abstract erotic body parts. You see too, colour has completely drained from the picture by now too. What connected Hesse and Bontecou's work was a shared commitment to investigating the limits of abstraction at a moment when much contemporary sculptural practice mandated a radical reduction in expressive, formal and anthropomorphic reference. There's something simultaneously abstract and bodily to their work, alongside this shared activation and deflation of sculptural space, and a determination to work in that interstitial space between painting and sculpture. Bontecou's desire, she said, was to capture something soft, something hard, something aggressive. This echoes the element of absurdity and bodily eroticism Hesse often invoked when discussing her own work. Both artists were adamant in their resistance to figurative or overtly bodily readings of their objects, and Bontecou in particular felt keenly that she wanted to refute the emerging accounts of the void in her works that were all too easily discussed as vaginal, a reading Bontecou rightly said was reductive. When, in 1965, Donald Judd described Bontecou's reliefs as threatening and possibly functioning objects, he offered a powerful description of their potential to affect the viewer both psychically and physically. Bontecou said that when she was making these, she had in mind the Bocca della Verità, or mouth of truth. Here's one of the ones with teeth in here. In Rome, which has this sense of invitation, but at the same time a slight sense of dread, and for her activating the hole or the cavity in this way was crucial. And here it is. This is what she had in mind when she's thinking of the threat of her voids, which, as this little clip here from Roman Holiday reminds us, this was very infamously animated by Gregory Peck when he pretends to Audrey Hepburn that his hand has been bitten off for telling lies. So I show this for a reason, because 1 year prior to the publication of Judd's article on Bontecou, a photograph accompanying a review of her work was published in the International Art Press. This photo did the rounds, that made the same point, although to rather more dramatic ends. The photo, as you see, is of a male viewer who stands bent forward in front of one of her works, his head inserted into the void as though cut clean from his body. The review emphasises the apparently mechanical or industrial appearance of the work, describing it as an exhaust pipe or piece of aeronautical construction, although the photograph belies such a reading, suggesting on the contrary that it's an animate, organic thing, a chomping mouth devouring its victim. The photograph of the beheaded, curious spectator is interesting less, I think, for its attention to the mechanical or industrial appearance of the work than for its animation of the abstract object as intimate and bodily. This image of decapitation, or castration even, clearly, if playfully, dramatises the idea of Bontecou's objects as threatening and possibly functioning. In fact, from the outset, the black hole in Bontecou's work has been interpreted as a gunhead, as a volcanic crater, or as a gaping, eroticised bodily orifice, a reading fuelled by the fact that they were made by a young woman working alone in her studio to produce these enormous heavy metal structures. that the photograph demonstrates a male viewer under attack makes clear the extent to which Bontecou's gender and the assumed gender of her sculpture came to matter, to appear obvious to reviewers of her work, the female aggressor devouring her male victim. According to Dory Ashton, Bontecou's works are crude reminders of destruction, recalling here Judd's description of them as terrifying objects. Somewhat surprisingly, given their abstract form, such a vivid formal vocabulary was common in discussions of Bontecou's work, as well as that of other artists such as Louise Bourgeois, whose 1966 latex sculpture Le Regard I'm showing you here. In 1972, Carter Ratcliffe, another important American critic at this time, invoked a bodily reading of her work by conflating the mechanical and biological. The carapaces, this is Ratcliffe, the carapaces, shells, exposed membranes that they entail, highlighting, he said, the powerful specificity of the openings they reveal, eyes, mouths, vaginas. Not all critics, however, were so keen to describe the void in Bontecou's work as bodily orifices, staring eyeballs, or abstract erotic forms. In 1965, the New York School poet and art critic John Ashbery questioned the widespread sexual readings of her work in an attempt to deflate such metaphorically laden descriptions, choosing instead to note their apparently functional aspects as potentially useful things, although precisely what it is they do is far from clear. In an attempt to steer debate away from the apparently sexual nature of their form, Ashbery points out, it's very hard to feel erotic about something that looks like the inside of an old broken down air conditioning unit. So he wanted to insist on this mechanical aspect. And I'm interested in the impulses that drive critics, us perhaps, to read into such resolutely abstract works in such explicitly gendered and sexualized ways. Gender, I think, gets read into work made by women artists far more than it ever does for male artists, for whom we seem more comfortable drawing a clear line between biography and work. When it does work the other way round, for example, in accounts of abstract expressionism in the 40s and 50s, for instance, it tied into a language of masculine genius and power, typically in very sort of flat-footed and heavy-handed ways. And of course, those kinds of biographical interpretation are just as problematic as those that seem set on describing abstract work by women artists as feminine, or as speaking to the woman question, as though an artist's gender was somehow essential or inherent to its materials and making. When artists, including Bontecou, Eva Hesse and Yayoi Kusama, declared that they were not feminists in the 1960s, it was, I think, in response to this kind of flattening language. Bontecou began working and exhibiting in the late 50s and into the 60s at a time prior to the establishment of a formalised feminist politics and a feminist art history to which to subscribe, and certainly before the idea of the woman artist carried much weight either institutionally or critically. We have to remain vigilant too about the too easy conflation that continues to see work by women artists as more intimately connected to questions of biography, craft, of an emotional attachment to making that frequently finds itself cast in terms of obsession, desire, and so on. I think Bontecou recognised that fact at the time, causing her to claim that she intended neither women's imagery nor female aggression. I feel art is not male or female. This is quite a common claim at the time. For other writers, notably women and later feminists, the power of Bontecou's work lay precisely in its refusal to cohere as feminine imagery. In 1965, Annette Michelson wrote in the catalogue for Bontecou's solo show at Iliana Sonnabend's Paris gallery that her art is neither feminine nor feminist. Rather, for Michelson, it was about reconciling contradictions. Through which it achieved, she wrote, that essentially androgynous character which distinguishes the art of her time. Michelson's demand that Bontecou's objects be understood as fundamentally androgynous was not adopted quite so readily back in New York. The focus on the so-called vaginal imagery her work embodies is due in part to Bontecou's role as a woman artist, but it's also, I think, a language tied very much to its time. And once critics realised that the name Lee belonged to a woman, accounts of her work commonly situated it somewhere in that uneasy space between abstraction, eroticism, violence, and the female body. In 1967, the critic and curator Lucy Lippard coined the term abstract erotic in her article Eros Presumptive, in which she discusses the work of Hesse, Kusama, Bontecou and others as examples of the non-specific yet erotically charged object, a term which comes closest perhaps to describing the encounter offered by Bontecou's work. Lippard refused to fix the works she discusses in terms of a sexualized reading, claiming that found in their work is a formal understatement that offered a non-verbal response that superseded mere sexual metaphor. These artists, Lippard writes, want their work to be freed to refuse stable readings and interpretations, preferring their forms to be felt, sensed, rather than read or interpreted. And if during the 1960s sculptural practice can be crudely schematised as a move from the specific object embodied in the phenomenologically grounded work of the minimalists to the subsequent post-minimalist and later dematerialisation of the object, Bontecou's work has much to tell us about the consequences for the viewing encounter. Spectators confronting her threatening and possibly functioning objects may be swallowed whole by the abyss or devoured in small fragments. The dematerialisation of the object of art during the 1960s is reconfigured here as a war waged on the space of sculpture and the sculptural discourses that it resists, with concerns more far-reaching than a shift in form, medium or site. Bontecou's work, a kind of radical abstraction, demonstrates that the war on sculpture is also a war on the space of subjectivity, and the too easy assumption that even the most abstract work, when made by a woman, reveals anything other than a fierce resistance to the idea that the work necessarily speaks of or to the feminine. And I'm going to end my comments there and hand straight over to Miguel. You're welcome.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for showing up tonight. I learned earlier that there are approximately 1 million things that you can be doing revolving around art history in Paris this evening, and you're here. So thank you very much for that. Thank you to Constance, of course, for the invitation to be here. Thank you to Jo for her remarks and for the conversation, which I'm sure that will be very interesting and robust conversation that will follow. And thank you to the Terra Foundation for sponsoring my year in Oxford. It's been fantastic. I'm learning a lot. I hope that the students are learning a lot. And so far, so good. Okay. When I was asked to speak on the subject of women's sculpture, this is the image that came first to my mind. It's a sculpture, it's a public commission by Magdalena Abakanowicz called Agora, which is located in Chicago's Grant Park. It's an installation consisting of 106 headless and armless figures cast in iron. Each of the figures is about 2.5 meters tall and weighs 820 kilos. Because the sculpture is iron, its exposure to the elements has imparted a rusted patina to the wizened, bark-like texture of the surface. The history of these iron giants is one of mixed reception. After its installation, some viewers criticized the sculpture of being too frightening and intimidating for public artwork. Because each of the sculpture's skin bears unique marks, scars if you like, that distinguish it from its neighbors, other viewers comprehended it as a celebration of individuality within a homogenizing culture. But to the artist, the title Agora meant the liberal democratic town square of Greek antiquity, a space in which ideas are brought to contest. But instead of speaking figures, these headless ones are necessarily mute. Thus, there is a sense of unspokenness in this space, a space of conversations yet to be imagined, a space of great potential, public and private, monumental and material, bodily, a space that is an arena of phase change and productive difference. To begin just one conversation today, I thought of some questions. What is women's sculpture in the latter half of the 20th century, and indeed into the 21st? Is there a vocabulary of form beyond the grid that pertains to the experience of artists who are women? And what are the conditions under which this is a question that we should even be asking? What the recent scholarship on women's sculpture ought to do, what I think my colleague Jo and I have been doing, is to protect the disruptive potential of this artwork from the pressures of univocal signification. Therefore, I have organized this talk, a series of reflections really around the words in, out, up, down, through, and between. Words that are not really words on their own, but rather parts of speech that show relationships between subjects and objects, incorporate ideas, and suggest hybrids. Words that are as agile and flexible as the artworks I wish to show you today. In and out. In 1961, the artist Anne Truitt constructed this sculpture first, which, as its title suggests, was the artist's first sculpture in a newly adopted language of geometric simplicity. First consists of 3 vertical white painted planks cut to resemble pickets of what is known as a picket fence, the kind of fence seen in virtually every suburban domestic landscape in America and enshrined in American cultural memory. Her preoccupation was not primarily the fence-like object itself, however, but the space around it. Truitt's sculpture is in the round and on the floor. It begs us to encounter it, walk around it, bend lower to see it. From its reverse, we can imagine ourselves in the position of being contained by it. From the front view, we see ourselves as the outsider approaching it. Think about Truitt's fence for a moment as the kind of structure that does not have any functional bearing on the structure that it seeks to imitate, a fence. As a fence with 2 reciprocal sides, it provides no stable separation, as a normal fence might. It proclaims the merger of inside and outside modes, locating the origin of this separation in a fragment from historical memory. In this context, the fence is not an innocuous object. It is not mundane, but loaded with consequence. Truitt launches an epistemological situation to heighten the beholder's awareness of his or her body on either side of the fence. How do you approach it? As an insider, a stranger, a newcomer, as someone who will recognize it and understand what it means already? Just how much cultural information does one need to constitute the meaning of the sculpture? These are all questions also posed by minimalism in its most orthodox intimations years later. But yet there is something more. By forcing the beholder to negotiate the separate sides of the fence ensures that he or she will meditate upon the function of the original object, the fence, and therefore upon the act of exclusion itself. While coming out of a very different sculptural tradition of neo-concretism in Brazil, I wish to show you this sculpture, only briefly and in passing, to help us understand a common thread between these artists' projects across continents. Clark's is a kinetic sculpture, a metallic disc that can be manipulated to create differently shaped folds and interiors, but also retains a flat exoskeletal quality, a pure surface. Clark's sculpture, while more improvisational in its approach to the viewer, is like Truitt's first. Both seem to reject a traditional stable identification of an inside and outside, or more suggestively, of insider and outsider subjectivities. Up and down. Now, for Truitt, the object itself retained importance as the sensory touchstone from which other extrapolations were made. And the sculptures following first increased in size to approach 2, sometimes 2.5 meters and more. This looking up to the object evokes the visual habit of the public monument, which, as I have written in my book, is an epistemological concern across 1960s sculptural practices. For Truitt, monumentality in scale was equated with an aspiration to history, the kind of public history that was in the same moment under tremendous revision through the various countercultural and civil rights movements of the era. In the end, the concept of history appealed to by these extraordinarily sensual objects, such as the seductively colored insurrection, which you see here, at the same time implicates by the private and personal experience of the viewer, in whom the sensory apparatus is grounded. Truitt's phenomenology, that is, the way of perceiving these seemingly laconic works, is one deeply concerned with the recollective experience of both artist and viewer, a nuanced point of view that was perhaps better understood in the tentative period before minimalism's absorption into theory later in the 1960s and 1970s. Okay, so what I didn't mention outright in my book on Truitt, but is something I do believe is true and perhaps should have stated more forcefully at the time, is that the culture of monumentality has a strongly paternalistic investment. And therefore, for an artist who is a woman to intervene upon public history is necessarily to revisit such practices as ones that are fundamentally socially engaged. And this is something that I see very much in the work of Sheila Hicks, whose monumental works address the question of up and down, both in terms of scale, as Truitt did, but also in terms of high and low. Since the materiality of her works, which are fibers, incorporates into sculptural media that which is traditionally associated with decoration and craft. In fact, Hicks is widely credited for spearheading an international reinvigoration of fiber arts practice within contemporary art. The title of this work, The Principal Wife Goes On, is an extension, I think, of Hicks's Yale MFA on ancient pre-Inca textiles, which was supervised by Ani Albers and George Kubler. In some Incan cultures, the principal or preferred wife leaves the home in the care of a secondary wife as she goes to the mountain to prepare a ritual sacrifice. Hicks reverses the viewer's usual encounter with monumental sculpture, which is that the symbolic status of the monument supersedes the quality of its materiality. So when we look at like the Vendôme column or something, we probably think first about what it symbolizes and then maybe secondly about like what it's made of. But here the principal wife foregrounds the importance of materiality and labor, which we cannot fail to comprehend as being women's labor, through the sheer abundance and accumulation of yarn in bound and loose skeins, cascading from a high trapeze and falling to the floor in threads around our feet. Through. In Simone Forti's Huddle, a group of dancers, interlinked at the arms or shoulders, form a tight, moving organism. One of them disengages and scales the mass of bodies, climbing over the huddle and rejoining it on the other side. The importance of performance to minimalism is well known and studied, and especially in the last decade, art historians have given us more to think about in terms of the collaborations between theater and sculpture that underpinned and perhaps even enabled a range of practices going forward from the 50s. For instance, Forti was one of the artist Robert Morris's most important interlocutors in the 1960s, precisely at the point at which he began working with pared down geometries and plain materials. Forti has herself acknowledged that this piece, Huddle, tends to behave more like a sculpture and less like a dance performance as such. Viewers come and go. There's no proscenium stage that sets the work apart from the viewer's own space. Yvonne Rainer, another choreographer, has referred to her own performances as objects, so that the line between performance and object is very much timid in this period. In short, what emerges in this watershed moment of the early 1960s, oh, I should pause to say, this is a re-performing of the 1961 dance on the High Line. I don't know if you've been to New York, but the sort of wonderful High Line on the west side. Okay. In short, what emerges in this watershed moment of the early 1960s is an aesthetic of interactivity in which bodies and objects come together. This is what the art historian Carrie Lambert-Beatty has called out as an issue of viewing, how the new interactivity in art retrains the beholder's senses to pay greater attention to the ambient conditions of their own spectatorship. When it comes to Huddle, for instance, what are we doing? Are we looking at it like a sculpture? How are we passing through space and time in reaction to it? I think this is very interesting when we bring this knowledge to a sculpture like Alison Knowles' Big Book of 1967, a work that compounds many of the themes we've been thinking about thus far today. Knowles' book is between 2 and 2.5 meters tall. It weighs about 900 kilograms. It contains a sleeping tunnel, blinking lights, a tape collage, and a film. Beyond sculpture, it is an entire world within a sculpture, one situated, or I should note, most famously situated, inside the artist's own apartment. As Bill Wilson wrote in Décollage in 1967, quote, "After wiggling through the tunnel, one enters the apartment, an illusionless reality, an unpretentious Manhattan living loft of the 1950s and 60s. This underworld, such as an epic hero usually enters, presents the processes of life nonchalantly, without varnish, for acceptance. Those who read the Big Book will take a journey through metaphors, will be on a different quest, and will arrive at different goals. But necessarily while they are in the Big Book, they will be as mobile, kinetic, audial, visual, energetic, and beautiful as it is," end quote. I love the duality of the language here because on the one hand, the Big Book monumentalizes the ordinary experience of the domestic sphere, transforming it into an interactive space of wonder. Clearly, Bill Wilson is very much taken with the drama of entering into the space. But on the other, we have a situation on the other side of seeing Knowles' ordinary apartment, just kind of as it is, a forthright acknowledgement of the domestic space, the space of the artist's own dwelling, simply and plainly seen after emerging from the book. Here's the part that I think is interesting. By recasting all who enter her apartment as performers, recall that you must pass through the frame of the book before emerging into the ordinary living area, so you become a performer yourself. Knowles places special emphasis on the choreographies, identities, and behaviors enacted inside the home versus inside the gallery. So it's not just how you move, but it's who you are when you're inside of these various spaces, the role that you embody. Time does not permit me to speak at length about this marvelous installation project, Suzanne Lacey's Full Circle, in detail. Suffice to say that Lacey magnifies some aspects present in Knowles' work, namely the question of the social and political impact of being and moving around in a certain space. In this work, which debuted in the 1992 season of Sculpture Chicago, an avant-garde series of community-based art projects, Lacey proposed the Surprise by Night installation of 100 stone monuments, about half-ton limestone boulders bearing the names of heroic Chicago women, to be installed throughout the city of Chicago, which to date did not include any monuments to women who had made contributions to Chicago's history. Lacey captures Knowles' sense of mobilizing a gendered space and pushes it to an extreme. Rather than affirming the public realm as male, Lacey's work protests the absence of women's history in public discourse and makes it everywhere present. So Forti, Knowles, and Lacey, they all share a confidence in the knowledge that by reframing the beholder's ordinary movement at home, in the gallery, in the public, this is a powerful technique for drawing attention to the larger historical factors that inform gendered discourses and between. Lastly, and what I hope is becoming clear is that women's sculpture in the 1960s was deeply invested in the project of overcoming binaries, in taking great intellectual satisfaction in being in between definitions, in demonstrating multitude, in demonstrating polyvocality in the face of specificity and duality. Color, as a formal quality, is one that is especially interesting to consider, given that artists of both genders experimented with a greater range of colors going forward from abstract expressionism, and seeing that color is the most deeply fungible and unpredictable formal category. The art critic Clement Greenberg, I thought I was going to get away without mentioning his name for once in my life, but alas, here he is again. The art critic Clement Greenberg, for instance, was not opposed to artists using a wide range of colors, and if we think about the artists that he championed, Hans Hofmann, Rothko, Pollock, Lewis, Noland, there are great colorists among them. However, when it came to sculpture in color, modernism became timid. This is to do with the fact that sculpture was secondary to the primacy of painting, in at least Greenberg's formulations. In painting, the excessiveness of color, and here I'm talking about its subjectivity and its natural appeal to the viewer's eye, could be regulated and reformed by the four sides of the canvas. In sculpture, the perspective is necessarily not restricted to a single point of view, and so color was excessive. Greenberg called Truitt's colors too feminine, not because she was a woman, and therefore the greater subjectivity of color was natural to her, but rather because color added too much to a style and medium that already strained the boundaries of formalist modernism. So feminine just meaning he didn't like it, versus specific to her gender. The takeaway point is that color conveyed a notion of ambiguity, of multivalence and dynamic pleasure that would tend to compel viewers away from the ideological unity of the modernist project. And it is revealing, I think, that so many women pursued color in the 60s and 70s, despite the knowledge that it would have been immediately identified and ridiculed as being excessively feminine. What I'm saying is that the stakes are different here. So if you have a sculptor like Donald Judd, he could experiment with color, but as a straight white male, this would not have been coded as kind of excessive and enigmatic and ambiguous, whereas for women artists, it was almost a sure thing. Okay. Judy Chicago's candy-colored rainbow picket, which was displayed at the Jewish Museum's iconic primary structures show in 1966, is just one example. In fact, Chicago applies the sweet pastel colors of the otherwise macho Los Angeles car culture to the rigid geometry of minimalist beams, exposing the dilemma of the gendered assumptions that one has about both. By the end of the 1960s, color's resistance to essentialism grew together with increasingly sophisticated feminist art criticism and theory, proposing that the category of woman as an identity and a semiotic sign was also undergoing a powerful transition. Process art, which is a natural extension of minimalism, is compatible with a philosophical shift towards hybridity and heterogeneity. Since the emphasis on the act of making is implicated also in the act of beholding, process art presents threshold conditions and delights in its in-betweenness. Benglis's 1969 Contraband is just such an in-between work, namely in between painting and sculpture, between 2 dimensions and 3. For this piece, Benglis enriched 500 pounds of liquid latex with fluorescent pigment, which she then cast onto the waxed gallery floor. The exact size of the work was determined by the medium itself. It's interesting to note that Benglis first designed this work for inclusion in the Whitney Museum's Anti-Illusion show, but withdrew it at the last minute, concerned that the color would clash with the other artworks in the exhibition, which were mostly monochromatic. The only other woman included in this show, by the way, was Eva Hesse, and I think the sculpture was expansion, but I'm not sure about that. Joe, you probably know. In the essay that accompanied the catalog, the critic Marcia Tucker wrote that the intention of the exhibition was to defeat the notion that art creates order out of chaos, Rather, the new anti-illusionistic art on view accepted new relationships between objects and incorporated materials that were not traditionally sculptural. Okay, fine. Here's the clincher. Tucker writes that her primary interest, speaking of Benglis, in color relationships is expressed in terms of the process of pouring, eliminating any a priori framework. Right. So Tucker is not here flying the banner for second wave feminism, but this last little bit, eliminating any a priori framework, this, I think, suggests a direction for how this work evolved into our understanding of it as feminist over the course of the 1970s. Eliminating any a priori framework, by the middle of the 1970s, it is increasingly understood that the category of woman is not an essential one, but rather an agglomeration of quotations and references that constitute femininity. Thus, woman exists between itself, between the sign and the body, at once a public participant in the social order, but also bodily and personal. And if you like, Georgia O'Keeffe was doing this exact same thing in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, getting her work to exist sort of between the sign of, and the body, I think, is something that's very important and interesting to think about. Through the act of publicizing her own disruptive female body, Benglis's clever pinup, which you see on the left, published in Art Forum in November 1974, immediately called out the collaboration of art critical and gallery world forces that still traded on the artistic identities of men. Here, Benglis took the unprecedented step of advertising for her own exhibition at the Paula Cooper Gallery, posed provocatively with a large latex dildo and wearing only a pair of cat-eye sunglasses. As you can imagine, critics, both male and female, lambasted Benglis, which she has defended by pointing out the double standard that men are not chastised for using images of themselves to promote their own work, and that the body of the male artist is already understood to be active and defiant. In fact, Benglis's work had been exploring these themes in the years leading up to the Art Forum controversy. Her 1971 wax encaustic lozenge, Excess, has a shape suggestive of both male and female parts depending on how one looks at it. What I think we can say is that excess in Benglis's contraband was the threat of too much color that would upset certain aesthetic conventions, whereas in the 1970s, the threat was located much more forthrightly in the woman's body as a sign, particularly when that body resists the certainty of classification. By the end of the 1970s, these questions were much more greatly ingested into art and art criticism, although, as I think our presence here today might prove, the question of how one's body, one's chosen gender, and its representation factors into aesthetic expression. That's a question that is still ongoing, in and out, up and down, through and between discourses. Thanks. So now we're going to do some banter, I think. So many interesting questions. One question that I had has to do with this, and forgive me, this is too sort of bizarre, but has to do with titling. Because you mentioned the titles of, so Bontecou, are all the works untitled?
Yes.
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 And then with Hess, she just has these like amazingly interesting titles, which kind of seduces you into learning more about the works. With Truitt, something that I kind of grappled with was how much to read into the paratextual matter. So how much do you rely on a title to give you information about the work? And I was just wondering your thoughts about about that and how you might have dealt with that in your own work.
Sure. Well, I think, so Bontecou titled one work that I can think of, and it's just called 1964, which was the year it was made, because it was one of the pieces that was installed in the new Lincoln Center in New York, where the commission, you know, they needed a title for the work. Other than that, she always stuck with Untitled, which is kind of interesting, thinking about her commitment to thinking about abstract expressionism and thinking that was her company. It seems actually much more minimalist to have Untitled or no title. So she does, so I suppose in the language of the 60s, she is titling them Untitled as opposed to them being no title, which sounds like nitpicking, but there's a kind of distinction there, right, for some artists. Hesse, although her work seems somehow less minimal and more raucous in some ways, was really of that time with her minimalist peers, where turning to the thesaurus was quite common. So she would go through the thesaurus looking for words, finding a word and others that would substitute. So many of her titles, several ingeminates, and so on. She was kind of having fun with with language, which is interesting given the resolutely material nature of the work in some ways.
A hang-up is a pun. I mean,
yes, I mean, so they're funny. Certainly those reliefs, the colourful reliefs, which she actually made in Germany for a year when she was away from New York, she really kind of has a huge amount of fun naming those, and they're almost just nonsense noises that you would make, as well as very kitsch or familiar names. So they're quite deflating in that way, funny, and I think that it's very different to the kind of titling of someone like Truitt. So I was interested on this, so teaching my students, opening my course on sculpture with a discussion of Truitt, and particularly your discussion of her. We really kept circling around the question of titles with her, because they found it hard to kind of get a purchase on what we were to do with these works, and so so I'd actually quite like to hear you say a bit more about that, because I think her titles seem more considered. I don't think they're funny or deflating in the way that maybe Hesse's were.
No, they are not funny. No. In fact, even the sounds of them some of them are very poetic, some of them sound very like Hardcastle, even in the name. Indeed. It's a surname, but it's a surname that has a certain kind of dour sound to it. And I think that for me, what allowed me permission to read into the titles, because one always has to beware of how much you do with the title, but allowed me to read into the titles was the fact that Truitt had really begun her career as a writer and had really thought for many years that she wanted to be a writer. And if you go into her archive, there are boxes and boxes, thousands of pages where she would draft and redraft poems, the same poem, changing one word, and then another draft, which was the very same thing. It was obsessive. And of course she has the three beautifully written artist journals. Yeah. So I allowed myself to think about literature as the mediating condition for Truitt's sculptural practice. And I think once I reconciled that, I thought, okay, the title can be information. It can be a part of the work. It can inform us. It can provide a way into the work. I don't think we can do that with every single person, but with Truitt, I do think it's quite deliberate. And
that's very interesting, relating to the issue of disruption and in-betweenness, because there would seem to be this enormous, unbridgeable gulf between a kind of resolute abstraction and the literary or the poetic titling. And she is, and I wonder why she's always, what's one of the things I find so interesting about someone like Truitt is she doesn't fit comfortably, you know, in common with many of these other artists, right? Too feminine for abstract expressionism, too kind of colourful for minimalism in some ways. So I think the emphasis on colour and excess is also important there. But this idea of focusing on artists that have been disruptive in some way, I think is really productive and something we've shared.
I think that it's, on that note, I think it's important to also say that the title is never what it is, so to speak. So the titles are deliberately meant to sort of seduce you into your own stores of memory, but it never explains what the work is. And actually, this is kind of like the sort of like a Barthes, like studium and punctum thing, right? So like there's the general information of like what we think that the sculpture might be, a kind of general context, but then the actual meaning of it is private. Like the meaning of it for her will never be the meaning of it for us, and so it's almost like doesn't matter what that is, because all we can come into contact with is this like exterior part of it. So it's really more about what we do with that information. But that idea of excess, I mean, there's the slipperiness, the betweenness, an excess which is kind of which these artists knew would have been threatening to viewers, and yet they kind of still soldier on with doing this work, I think is massively meaningful for the period. Yeah.
Absolutely. Just sticking with titles for a second, when I was thinking about your presentation and the terms that you've used, inside, through, between, which are really productive and I think incredibly helpful in formulating our response to these works, I was reminded of the title of a really important sort of feminist revisionist exhibition in the 90s that was curated by Catherine de Zager, Inside the Visible, which had a very, very long, complicated subtitle I'm going to forget, but it was something like in, of, through, between, transversing the feminine. Am I close? Kind of. But this idea of trying to reclaim a more radical idea of femininity that was precisely weaving between and through. So in a way it was kind of radically ahistorical in pairing different kinds of artists. Many of these you know, such as Clark and Kusama and so on. But I think the kind of the hybridity of the sculpture, but also the flexibility that allows us in terms of interpretation was there for critics at the time who would try and pin them down instead. So someone like Bontecou, we have critics really in very different camps trying to make sense of the work, and it seems that kind of in-betweenness wasn't really acceptable. Maybe the stakes were too high for sculpture to not kind of find a particular place within its history at that moment.
Yes. Yeah, the 50s are not the 60s or not the 70s.
Right.
This is the other thing.
Absolutely.
And I've been in the process of reconciling that myself.
Yeah.
And you'd have to think in the 1950s, I mean, the stakes really were very high. I mean, you had Helen Frankenthaler. You had, I mean, Lee Bontecou. I mean, you had artists who were women who were working, but they're not being represented by galleries. It was Truitt's first gallery show. Andre Emmerich asked her to remove her first name, so that people would go. You know, and then it was a great success. But I do think it is because the stakes were too high by the 1960s, by the later 60s, by the 1970s, I think. And also, I think that Hesse was involved in a scene of artists who legitimated her work, and I think that was also very helpful for her to have this kind of community that was legitimating her.
Indeed, and you needed that sense of community, but also people needed to understand you in relationship to others, and I think Judd's essay, Specific Objects, is so fascinating, both for it, because for many years it was really just described as a shorthand for a manifesto for minimalism, and that's been, I think, well and truly challenged by now, just by looking at the sheer range of quite bizarre artists and artworks he brings together, and it's really just an attempt to make sense of the contemporary scene, you know, what sculpture is, and it's very much defined for him in terms of what it isn't, so it's not what we previously thought a modernist sculptural practice could be. And under this very neither painting nor sculpture umbrella, he can bring in such a diverse group.
I was thinking of, actually, as I was preparing for this, I was rereading Kristeva's essay. Now, you know, we're really in the weeds if Kristeva gets to make an appearance, but Giotto's Joy, where it's about, I believe, the use of the color blue in Bellini or something like this. But anyway, in Kristeva's scholarship, specificity is always associated with patriarchy. And I think that's a really interesting nuance if we bring that back to something like Donald Judd's Specific Objects. And maybe it's there, maybe it's not, but I think that thinking about specificity and patriarchy as a kind of pairing permits us to rethink that entire essay and how the specific object and how that the afterlife of that and how that was understood and how that became synonymous with minimalism also is a part of this larger conversation about sculpture and gender in the 60s and 70s.
Absolutely, and I thought your discussion around monumentality was very interesting here, that of course the idea of the monument and that language itself is highly gendered. Although we'd need to again be careful of not falling into that trap of, you know, women make work that's neither this nor that. It's kind of, we don't know what it is, whereas we know what a specific object is.
Yes.
You end up falling into just another binary, don't you? Of,
yeah.
You know, women are non-binary and male
right.
sculpture is, you know, it doesn't kind of work in that way. But I think this idea of specificity, of naming something, is something that's being resisted by Bontecou, certainly.
Yeah, right.
You know,
certainly,
which
yes.
makes it such an interesting case study against someone like Truitt, who are doing things, coming at it just from very, very different
That's right.
Places. And of course that they didn't claim a language of femininity
right.
or feminism. And you'll find this even today, talking with, I was talking to Phila de Barlow just last
right.
week,
yeah.
and she was, you know, she's happy to kind of talk about the macho status of her sculpture, you know, because there's, you know, because it's not in terms of gendering the work, but in understanding its kind of ability to kind of occupy space in a rather
yes.
kind of aggressive manner, which she
yeah,
wants it to do. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, right. Yes. We could go on and on, but perhaps we should turn it over to you. I believe we have this slightly bizarre thing where you have to wait for the microphone to come to you before speaking into it, so that it can all be captured by the recording.
Hi, thank you very much. I really enjoyed both of those talks, and I'm not sure whether what I've been thinking about whilst listening will really work out into a question, but I was really struck by Lee Bontecou's work, who I really enjoy her work anyway, and just about how it kind of avoids these various sort of signifiers of the feminine that you've kind of mentioned in terms of the other female artists, so in terms of the shape, colour, process, materials, and also the scale of her work, that it actually kind of... Yeah. But rather that it's actually quite heavily gendered in terms of male gender and this idea of male labour. So I thought, I was wondering whether kind of this kind of putting on this sense of the female body onto it, or trying to find those sort of female aspects, was some sort of pushback against her kind of stepping on the toes of male artists, or the sense of what is the male role in terms of kind of the mechanical. And then I was also thinking about the mechanical and the erotic female body, and that's something that kind of arises again in popular culture, from something like Metropolis with the False Maria, or something you see it again and again, women in roles that are kind of, you know, male gendered roles, but that is sort of presented from the male gaze, or is somehow the male in the role of the creator again. So I was just, yes, like I said, I'm not sure whether that's kind of a question, but I wondered whether some of the responses you saw, whether there was an aspect of, like I say, some sort of pushback, some sort of ridicule of her actually engaging with that sort of side of work.
That's really interesting. I mean, trying to understand the impulse behind a certain reading is fascinating, and looking at contemporary criticism, which is something I love doing. You know, what did people say at the time, before there's a theoretical language, before you've got all the lovely benefit of hindsight, which our historians have when we reflect back. I suppose I'm not sure that I would understand it as a kind of punitive reading or a kind of ridiculing. I think, although I could see how it could appear that way, I think what we see with the kind of critics that were writing about her, and Judd included, was a very serious attempt at getting to the heart of what it was they found important about her work. I think that it was far more likely that you would simply be ignored and not reviewed than, so however wrong-footed some of that language definitely is. I think it does betray a kind of seriousness of engagement with her work. And what's fascinating is how it still nonetheless couldn't escape this gendered reading. And she says at the time, and Lee Lozano, another Lee that I've worked on at this moment, says the same. As soon as people realise that, you know, that you would think it's good to have an androgynous name because it gets you access, but of course it doesn't, because people just assume you're a man, and once they realise you are not, then you're back exactly where you started. And so I think the fact perhaps that she was working with familiar and recognisable materials, then associated with the assemblage artists, Chamberlain and Rauschenberg and so on, provided them with a language. But it's interesting how quickly it became gendered in her context, and critics would express surprise that she was able to make these things on her own, but actually it's not. I mean, you can lift like a metal skeleton, like, you know, it's not this idea that this is impossible labour that she was somehow undertaking by working with a big object just seems it seems quite strange, but it was fascinating to critics at the time. And there are so many photographs of her in her loft working. Hugo Moulas and Hans Namuth, you know, these really well known photographers who documented the downtown scene, absolutely fixed on what it was to see her in her studio, which is slightly different to someone like Kusama, who was entirely self-fashioning. She was commissioning the photo, you know, she was controlling every part of the photographic process when we see her posing with her works in a way that is different with Bontecou. But when pressed, and she was sort of slightly older as well, so absolutely of a generation that just did not want to be pressed on the gender question. She did not have an interest, I suppose I would say, did not have a vocabulary at that moment to articulate what she may have done had she been working slightly later. So when pressed, she talks about aggression in response to anger at war or social inequalities and injustices that she's hearing on the radio when she works. And she made early sculptures of guns and these strange gas masks, which suggest more of a kind of sort of a horrific kind of harbingers of either a future of war or reflecting back on the Second World War, where she would work with reclaimed materials. So I think this question of specificity is formal, it relates to the formal materials, but also to the historic moment. And I think the early 60s was so different to even 1968, for example, when suddenly, when a language at least began to emerge. So maybe not ridicule, but I think you're absolutely right. It's this wrangling with what to do with the work once we know it's by a woman that seems to preoccupy some of the best art critics at that time. And it really needed someone like Lucy Lippard to come along in sort of 1966 and begin to tentatively feel her way towards a kind of language, a more nuanced language of gender that would, over the next few years, really formalise until she sort of, as she says, comes out as a feminist. As she says, she felt she did that far too late, but of course she was really ahead of many of her contemporaries. And
then you have someone like Judy Chicago who retrospectively reads feminism throughout her practice.
Right. Yeah,
she has a kind of phase change herself and then looks back at all the old stuff and says, of course all of this is feminist work, but she wasn't necessarily thinking about it at the time. But something you said I think is so interesting, and that has to do with the studio. And I think that that is a potentially like very fertile place for research, is who are the artists, male or female, who are permitting people to come into their studios and watching them work, and what are the conversations like there? Because you're absolutely right. Hans Nemeth, I think of that Jackson Pollock video, almost to the exclusion. I believe he went to Frank Stella's studio. I mean, he clearly went to Bontecou's studio. And so I'm just wondering if there's a history of the studio visit that has yet to be written. Because I'm thinking of others like, like Louise Nevelson, I think, infamously didn't want anybody in her studio. And Agnes Martin, who was notoriously reclusive, and so being in the studio and who's coming in and how that is dynamically changing either the work or the way people perceive the work, I think is
and how
so
artists, particularly women, are staged or stage themselves or perform with the work, or somehow the body enlivens or tells us like Kusama, I think, is sort of performing her work for us. So she will clamber on top, or she will touch or squeeze or press against it. So it's a kind of fantasy of what one might do with the works. Eva Hesse knew that. That photograph I showed of her with the relief sculptures. You know, she's, you know, Eva Hesse isn't Eva Hesse at this moment. So this is a photo over which she has, you know, control. It's, it was a kind of flyer for her first show. And I think there's a humour and a wit there. You see it in the Bourgeois photograph, that the joke is between her and Mapplethorpe as well as with us, clearly, and so on. And so I think there's a kind of wit to performing the body that, even if it wasn't, it didn't register as feminist at that moment, was clearly a very, very self-conscious and very intelligent, funny understanding of how the work would be read or could be performed at that time.
Absolutely.
Really a simple question, which is I'm really struck by the way they put pressure on the material, on the medium. There is really, they push the medium to its limit compared to the generation of Martha Rothler, and where it's the decoding, the cultural roles that we have been assigned. And so is that something that's just the early 60s that the male artists also do, because medium is the question? And then the fact that those amorphic kind of shapes that they are making, in a way, engage the viewer differently, so the bodily associations are not literal or not explicit. So it seems to me extremely inventive compared to what happened later, in a way, in terms of its artistic explorations of the objects. And so it's a discovery, I find, because we are so used to feminist art being iconic or literal, or getting the message through in ways that are photographic or whatever, and this really comes from the inside. So
I mean thank you. I mean, for me it's precisely this kind of messy, awkward, kind of politically unpalatable at moments kind of explosion of an interest in the body and its dispersal and the erotics and the violence that is untheorized, but it's happening at the level of the materials and the form. So Bontecou's work from the beginning, the fabric, where she fixes it, the taut fabric to the metal structure, the tension, it begins to give, so it's got little holes and tears. The work itself is kind of coming apart. Then Eva Hesse's work with latex, once she discovers that in fact it is impermanent, that it won't have a long life, that it will dry and crack, she decides to carry on regardless. I think artists working with quite messy, dangerous materials, very experimental, fiberglass. I mean, artists have talked about this since. I think Yvonne Rayner remembers being in the loft with Robert Morris, soaring, no masks, through big sheets of fiberglass. So there's this kind of completely wild engagement with materials that I think, in a way, is their kind of theoretical exploration of the body. Does that make sense? I think it is very exciting at that moment before things get maybe locked down a bit more intellectually, perhaps.
Thank you very much for this great talk and dialogue. And I had a question about the fact that in the 1960s, a lot of artists start to define themselves also as art workers, and emphasizing the fact that they're working. And sometimes, like people, like artists like Karl André wanted to get closer to actual workers. And how did artists like Lee Bontecou relate to that movement? That also, for artists like Karl André, there was something about, people talked about the masculine ethos of his work, and that was connected to his passion of being an art worker. How did artists like Lee Bontecou relate to that definition of artist as an art worker?
Well, that's a great question, and in a way this is another instance of her being kind of an awkward fit, and I think Truitt in some ways, you know, they're just kind of out of that kind of moment, even though they're working alongside it. So Bontecou does not get involved with the Art Workers Coalition. She is of no interest in unionising. She, when pressed, it's always about abstract expressionism, freedom, nature, space exploration. It's always about the world out there, rather than the immediate context in which she's working, almost exclusively. She ended up teaching. She would mainly teach to make money. She had no, you know, other than that, she really dedicated all her time to quietly working on her own. So she really wasn't a part of that community. Although they knew her, she knew them, Eva Hesse was a big admirer of hers and so on. But I think just, again, it's this difference of a few years generationally. She's out of that picture, but yeah, the politics were always about the world out there, never about her world. It's a great question, and it shows that kind of diversity of experience at that moment, you know, because women artists are certainly not kind of coming together at that moment. I don't know what Truitt's...
right, no, there was certainly, she was not a part of the AWC, she's not, part of it is geographical too, she worked out of Washington, D.C., which was of course not New York, but she was older, she had 3 children, she, I think, very much saw her labor as being one facet of all the different kinds of labor that she would do in any given day. Her work ethic was kind of, talk about limits and extremes. I mean, she would wake up at like 4 or 5 in the morning and then go to the studio. I mean, she had this incredible work ethic, but it was not as much a part of the overtly a part of the 60s protest movement. But I do think that when we see, well, I guess a couple of things. First of all, when she was in Japan, Truitt went to Japan for 3 years, and she sort of on her own reached out to these various aeronautical companies to learn how to use different space-age materials in making sculpture with metal, and then she kind of supervised the solderer, because I guess she didn't know how to solder this like new kind of thing, and so she didn't know how to use this specific kind of soldering, which was an aeronautical soldering. So she's like supervising soldering, and I mean that sounds all very kind of like managerial and workforcey, you know, and what I guess what that leads me to think of, which is the second part of this, is that by the time we have in the later 1970s into the 1980s, we really are at a point in the United States at least where there's thinking about women as managers and women workers in the workforce, and there's kind of like a popular literature, but also just there's more out there about women as workers, and I think that, you know, I think if anything, Truitt probably thought of herself that way, as a kind of like efficient worker. Yeah,
and that's actually leads to quite an important point that I think we've taken as read and haven't kind of explained, which is that although they weren't affiliating with these movements, either because they were out of sync temporally or they didn't have the language, I think that it's, you know, they were in a very deep and serious way feminist artists, even though it's anachronistic, and that they weren't claiming this word for themselves, but I think reading them as political artists. So I was thinking about you know, they weren't explicitly identifying with apolitics at that moment, but that they were deeply serious and kind of political in a way that did speak to questions of gender and labour, I think is quite clear.
Absolutely.
Does that?
Absolutely,
more rambly than I meant.
Yes. Yes, I agree.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talks. I have maybe a two broad question. What I found really striking and exciting about your talks and the works that you presented is the way they just don't really fit into the canonical history of sculpture in the 1960s. And I'm wondering what we should do about it. Do we need to have several parallel stories that, you know, sometimes intersects and sometimes are in conflicts and sometimes interconnect, or do we need to just abandon completely this canonical history of the 1960s just because it doesn't work? And is there an opportunity to maybe reread some of the works by these canonical male artists such as Carl André or other in the light of what we learn from Anne Truitt or Lee Bontecou, and in a way can we start with, for instance, the lines that you showed into the work of women artists and try to make the male fit in that for once, you know? I don't know.
I don't know, I think we abandoned it, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, I think you either, that's the kind of choice that you either abandon it, you rewrite it. I mean, so for me, it's Griselda Pollock has been very important for feminist art history in questioning the canon. So on the one hand, there it is, it exists, it's the narrative we work with and press against, but quite clearly the solution is not to simply cram women back into it, to kind of just go and find all of those people that were, you know, left out at a certain point and squash them in, because you're still maintaining a certain understanding of how things worked. And a proper feminist art history would, in fact, challenge that from the bottom up. So it's an important question. I think that there is much work being done that does challenge this by reading artists perhaps against the grain or against themselves. And I think also attending seriously to those individual artists' work and seeing actually what got left out of their practice in order to tell a more tidy story. So we rarely hear about Carl André's dog shit sculptures, because how do you deal with such a scatological, funny, irreverent practice when we're trying to claim him for a serious Marxist, minimalist commentator? So I think in a way there is a process of archival work that was simply those artists. No artist is as straightforward as the narrative into which they've been inserted, is, I suppose, one response I would have. But it is a problem, it is the thing that we have, and that as art historians we have to work with and against.
This last piece is really important. Like the 60s, at least, are a lot more surprising and bizarre than they are even represented in the many pages of text. So artists themselves, you know, it's very unusual for an artist to kind of set about saying, I am a pop artist, or I am a minimalist, or I am this or that. I mean, we always have to remember that these labels are retrospectively added. And so with that kind of foreknowledge, like, why don't we just abandon pop art? Why don't we abandon these terms? Because clearly they're meaning less and less in 2017 than they used to in previous generations. So why not put someone like Roy Lichtenstein in conversation with someone like Anne Truitt, whatever it might be. Let's just see what happens when you do that. I do this assignment with my students where this is the most terrifying thing for them, but I put in envelopes, and I just put artworks from the 1960s in envelopes. And so they can't see what's inside, and I just put it out on a table, and they all come to the front, and they tick 2 envelopes at random, and then the assignment is that they write an essay based on a comparison of those 2 things. And oftentimes you get the most interesting, even if it's a little ragged and bizarre and not like totally archivally substantiated, what you get is these ideas that come out of that. So let's look at Frank Stella with Andy Warhol. Let's look at, let's just take random things and start putting them in conversation, because that, I think, would be more exciting to the artists themselves too, to understand their work as having this larger dialogue. So.
And also, of course, understanding there is no true story, there is no correct story that we're going to get to the longer we spend in the library or interviewing or writing. It's always a new fiction that we're telling, and I guess the question is what's at stake in that new account. And if we want to avoid just the monographic, I suppose something like minimalism or pop gives us kind of the group to work with, but they fossilize so quickly they become monographic too. So I think we need to understand that we can only ever work within the kind of discourses that we have, but we need to keep troubling them as your students learn. That's wonderful, that's terrific. I might steal that.
Please do, it's terrifying for them, so I love it.
So I think we can follow the conversation.
Great.
With a glass of wine, if you want. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.